Sarah, open the door. I know you're in there. Her hand froze halfway to the wine glass on the table. The glow from the documentary flickered across the television screen, but every image sliding past felt distant and hollow. Sarah's body went rigid, and a familiar coldness, sharp as ice, slipped down her spine. The kind of cold she once believed she had left behind forever. The knocking came again, harder this time, more violent. You can't ignore me forever. She should call the police. That was what the restraining order existed for. Her lawyer had emphasized it during their last meeting. If Derek showed up again, call immediately. But her phone was in the kitchen, and to reach the kitchen, she would have to walk past the front door. Her legs felt bolted to the floor, unable to move, as if gravity inside the apartment had suddenly doubled just to keep her standing there, trembling. I see your car outside. Don't pretend you're not home. His voice sharpened into anger, hissing through his teeth like a wounded snake. After everything I've done for you, owe me an explanation. A low, steady voice rose from behind the sofa, making her jolt. How long has he been doing this? Sarah spun around, her heart thundering. She had almost forgotten someone else was in the room. Michael Stone was still seated exactly where she had invited him less than 5 minutes ago, looking neither surprised nor unsettled. He sat comfortably in her tiny living room as though he belonged there. And in a way, he did. He owned the building. He was the one who had knocked on her door to discuss upgrades to the security system for the entire complex. And now he was staring at the front door with an expression she could not read, his posture utterly still, in a way that made her feel he was far more dangerous when he wasn't moving. It's the 4th time this month, she whispered, her voice raw. I have a restraining order, but he keeps finding a way. She didn't finish before a heavy kick slammed against the door. Derek was raging outside. You think you're better than this. You think you can throw away 3 years like garbage. 3 years. 3 years of fear, of soft but ruthless threats. 3 years of becoming a shadow of herself. Always apologizing, always shrinking. Words carved into her memory like a dull blade. I didn't mean it. You just drive me crazy. No one will ever love you like I do. She had left him 6 months ago. There were still days she couldn't believe she had managed it. Michael stood. He moved like water, fluid yet powerful. And in an instant, he was beside her, close enough that she felt the solid, intimidating presence of him. Stay here, he said softly, without a tremor. Mr. Stone, you don't have to. But he was already walking toward the door. Sarah's breath caught. She wanted to stop him, wanted to insist this wasn't his problem, that she could handle it. But the truth was she couldn't. For 6 months, she had tried to be strong, tried to pretend it was over. Yet Derek kept coming back, and the police never seemed to make a difference. Michael slid the lock open with a decisive motion and pulled the door wide. Derek froze mid-swing, shocked by the sudden opening. His eyes were glassy, his breath thick with alcohol, his shirt wrinkled, his tie crooked. He was clearly drunk and furious. Who the hell are you? He snarled, face flushed. I live here, Michael replied lightly, as if they were chatting over coffee. A lie, of course. But Derek didn't know that. Bullshit. Sarah lives alone. I want to talk to my girlfriend. Your ex-girlfriend, Sarah said from behind Michael, her voice shaking. We broke up 6 months ago. Derek spotted her over Michael's shoulder, his face twisting with anger and wounded pride. Baby, come on. Don't be dramatic. We always work things out. We can fix this like always. There's nothing left to fix, she said, forcing herself to stand steady, even as every cell in her body begged her to step back. You need to leave. You're violating the order. That stupid piece of paper. Derek laughed bitterly. You think that'll stop me after everything I did for you? Michael's voice didn't get louder, but it dropped several degrees colder. Is that what you call showing up at a woman's home after she's repeatedly asked you to stay away, caring? Derek finally began to notice that the man in front of him wasn't budging, and Michael was at least a head taller, his solid build impossible to miss, even beneath a simple black shirt. The alcoholic bravado in Derek's posture began to deflate. This is between me and Sarah, he muttered, stepping back half a pace. No, Michael said, eyes locked on him. It's not anymore. If you're listening to this and something in the story stirs a feeling inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like and share the video so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories every day. And if you don't mind, may I ask where you're watching from? Leave a comment below, and tell us which corner of the world this story has reached. We cherish every message you share. Michael still didn't move, didn't blink. He filled the doorway entirely. A living wall of flesh and bone stronger than any lock Sarah had ever installed. Derek's eyes darted, his throat working as he tried to swallow. His mind clearly weighing whether to keep pushing or retreat like he had before. Sarah could see the tension in his face, the anger, the hatred, and beneath it an unfamiliar uncertainty. He clenched his jaw. What are you to her? The new boyfriend. He spat, flicking his gaze toward Sarah as if searching for betrayal. Real fast, Sarah. Only 6 months, and you already let this guy in your house. Is that who you are now? Sarah felt heat surge across her face. A painful mix of anger and humiliation. That was always what Derek did, twisting everything so she became the one at fault. But this time, before she could speak, Michael answered, "She doesn't owe you anything. Not today. Not ever. You've been asked to leave. This is your last chance to do it peacefully." His voice was still low and even, but all softness had vanished. Something invisible filled the air, heavy and unyielding. Derek lifted his chin, raising his voice in a final attempt to salvage pride. "If you think you can keep me from seeing her, you're wrong. I'll be back tomorrow, the day after, next week. I told you I don't give up." Michael stepped forward. Derek had no choice but to step back. Sarah couldn't see exactly what Michael did, but she heard a faint sound from his collar, a small movement that carried enormous weight. Then she heard Derek inhale sharply, shifting back another step. The challenge drained from his eyes, replaced slowly by weariness, then fear. Michael spoke quietly, almost a whisper, yet the sound filled the narrow hallway. "Do you know who I am?" Derek's eyebrows nodded as he tried to look unimpressed, but his body betrayed him with a small flinch. He said nothing, silence stretching until he finally squinted, studying Michael more closely, as though noticing something he had missed. Sarah stood frozen, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She didn't know what Michael had said, didn't know what influence he carried, but she saw Derek's face change. The flesh faded to ash, his lips trembled. "Oh God, I didn't know." Michael didn't step back. "Now you do. And I'll say this only once. You will forget this address, her number, even her name. You will not show up at her job. You will not reach out to her friends or family. If you appear anywhere near her again, I won't need the police." Derek stammered. "Are you threatening me?" Michael corrected, his eyes like cooled steel. "I'm explaining the situation to you very clearly, very politely. The choice is yours." A moment of absolute silence followed where the only sound Sarah could hear was her own pulse. Then Derek nodded like a caught thief. "I understand. I'm leaving. I'm sorry. I didn't." Michael cut in, stepping back and closing the door with a firm motion. Sarah heard frantic footsteps racing down the hall, then the stairwell door crashing open and shut, and then nothing. She dropped onto the sofa without remembering how she moved. Her entire body shook, her fingers laced together so tightly they hurt. Michael locked the door, slid the bolts into place, then turned toward her. "I'm sorry," she blurted, the words spilling out on instinct. "I'm sorry you had to see that. I'm sorry I brought this to your door. I'm sorry I couldn't, Sarah." He interrupted gently, taking a seat on the coffee table in front of her until their eyes were almost level. "You did nothing wrong." The words were simple, soft, yet they struck straight into her chest. She had heard them before from her sister, from the counselor at the women's center. But from him, after everything that had just happened, they reached a part of her that had been locked tightly shut. "What did you say to him?" she asked, her voice still rough. Michael smiled faintly, not arrogant, just calm. "I only reminded him that there are worse things than attracting police attention." "You won't," her voice cracked. "You won't hurt him, will you?" "I don't need to," Michael said, leaning back. Men like him are only loud when they think they're the most dangerous person in the room. Once they realize someone bigger, quieter, more frightening is standing in front of them, they deflate like a punctured balloon. Sarah swallowed hard. Michael watched her, his expression softer now. "I'm not a violent man," he said. "But I am someone who protects what's mine." He paused, then added, "This building, the people in it, and now you." She stared at him, unsure how to absorb everything. In less than half an hour, her world had been turned upside down. Yet, one thing she knew with absolute clarity was this. For the first time in months, she felt safe. Truly safe. The next morning, Sarah woke in a state that felt almost like collapse. She had tried to sleep after everything that had happened the night before, but the old nightmares returned as if knocking on her door again, pulling her through ragged breaths and restless dreams. And she lay still for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling as she tried to steady herself, repeating silently that she was still here, still safe, that Derek could not come back after facing Michael, whispering it to herself like a fragile incantation. But when she stepped out of her apartment on her way to work, she froze. A sleek black SUV was parked right in front of the building, and a man stood beside it, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair, and he took one step forward when he saw her. "Miss Carter?" he asked, his voice low and even polite to the point of being almost cold. She blinked and nodded. "I'm Vincent," he said. "Stone assigned me to drive you to work." Sarah frowned. "Since when?" "Since last night," Vincent replied. "He made it clear you should not travel alone until he confirms that Derek is no longer a threat." Sarah looked at the car, then at Vincent, then around her, but no one seemed to be watching her specifically. The morning noise of the city continued as usual. Car horns and footsteps, and the rush of people heading to their day. Yet everything around her felt strangely still. "I didn't ask for this," she murmured. Vincent nodded. "I know, but he didn't ask whether you wanted it. He gave the order." Something in the way he said it made her shiver and feel unexpectedly safe at the same time. She opened the door and slipped into the back seat. The interior was clean, warm, untouched. Vincent didn't say another word during the drive. He focused on the road with the kind of meticulous care that made every turn feel deliberate, like each movement had been calculated beforehand. When the car stopped in front of her office building, he turned and handed her a small card with a phone number. "If you need anything during your shift, call. I'll be waiting until you're done." She looked at the card, then at him, and managed to whisper a thank you. Vincent nodded again and returned to the driver's seat. Sarah walked into the office, her mind still unable to make sense of everything. She worked, but hardly focused, her thoughts circling the same question over and over. Why was Michael doing all of this for her? They had only just met. He was the landlord. He had no reason to assign a driver, upgrade her security, or confront a man like Derek. She checked her phone. No new messages. And yet, something warm and unnameable settled quietly inside her. Not fear, not anxiety, but a kind of surprised comfort. In the afternoon, when she stepped out of the building, Vincent was there exactly as promised. He opened the door, waited until she was inside, then started the engine. As the SUV pulled into traffic, her phone vibrated. A message from an unsaved number. "Everything all right, Jay?" She stared at the screen. That single letter J made her heart miss a beat. "I'm okay. A bit overwhelmed, but in one piece. Thank you." A moment later, another message appeared. "Tonight, I'll have someone start installing a private alarm system in your apartment, and I think we should talk. This evening. If you agree." Sarah stared at the words as the SUV glided through the streets of Portland. For the first time in months, she wasn't curled up on a bus seat, listening for footsteps behind her. Instead, a quiet man was driving her home, and another man was trying to make the world less frightening for her. And she didn't know why, but a large part of her, the part that still believed in good things, wanted to believe that maybe this time things could be different. The apartment was filled with the soft warmth of yellow light as Sarah poured 2 cups of ginger tea, the only thing she had left in the pantry after a long day. Michael sat on the sofa, not folding his arms, not leaning back tensely, simply existing in the room with her. The space between them felt quiet, but not suffocating, like a rare pocket of safety inside the storm she had been living through, and she hadn't expected to find herself stepping into such a space. She set the tea in front of him and took the armchair opposite, her hands clasped lightly in her lap. He thanked her with a small nod and waited in silence. Not pushing, not prompting, not digging for a story she wasn't ready to tell. His patience loosened something inside her. It felt less like an interrogation, more like a space she could choose to open or protect. She looked down at her hands, her fingertips trembling faintly. "I used to think I was smarter than this," she began in a voice so small it nearly vanished beneath the soft ticking of the heater. "I used to think I would never become the kind of woman who lives in fear." Michael didn't interrupt. His gaze stayed steady, not invasive, not dismissive, just quietly present enough for her to know he was listening. Derek wasn't terrible, at least not at first. He was sweet, charming. When I met him, I had just moved to Portland and didn't know anyone. He took me out to dinner, picked me up after work, remembered my mother's birthday, even though he had never met her. She let out a faint, brittle laugh. The sound of old memories rubbing against scars. Things started changing after about 6 months. Not obviously, not violently, just little comments. You're wearing that dress. Too revealing. Your friends don't care about you the way you think. Why didn't you answer my message right away? She looked up, meeting Michael's eyes for the first time since she began. Do you know that feeling when someone starts choking you without using their hands? Just with their words. Michael didn't answer immediately, but he nodded slowly, as if to say he not only understood, but had watched someone he cared for endure something similar. Perhaps in his own family, perhaps in a life he didn't talk about. Sarah drew a long, shaky breath. At first, I thought I just needed to try harder, that if I didn't make him angry, everything would be fine. I started texting him constant updates. I cut back on overtime because he hated waiting. I stopped seeing my friends. He said he only needed me, and I stupidly believed it. Her voice tightened. Michael didn't move closer. He didn't reach for her. He understood that sometimes space was the only thing holding a person together after he smashed my phone because I got a call from a male coworker. I started hiding everything. I thought if my friends didn't know, they wouldn't be dragged into it. I thought I could endure a little longer. That as long as he didn't hit me, I was still okay. She let out another quiet, aching laugh. It sounds foolish, doesn't it? Setting a boundary just to lie to myself that it hasn't been crossed. Michael tilted his head slightly, his voice warm yet firm. No, not foolish. That's survival. Sarah froze, then burst into tears. Not loud, just silent streams slipping down her face as if they had been waiting years for permission to fall. Michael said nothing. He simply waited. After a few minutes, she wiped her cheeks. I wrote the request for a restraining order during a sleepless night. I asked my sister to come with me because I was too afraid to go to the police station alone. He didn't hit me. I had no bruises. I was terrified they wouldn't believe me. But they did. They helped me. I left my old apartment, changed my number, switched jobs. I thought I was free. She exhaled and gave a small sad smile until I saw his car parked outside this building. Michael set his tea down, his gaze no longer silent, but filled with something deep and unmistakable. A kind of respect that didn't need to be spoken aloud. You did what not everyone has the strength to do, he said. You left, Sarah looked at him, but he still came back. That's not your fault, Michael replied. I know, she whispered, her voice feather light. I've been told that so many times by my therapist, by my sister, by my lawyer. But today, hearing it from you after everything that happened, I think for the first time, I believe it. Michael smiled. Not a smile of triumph, not pity, but the quiet expression of someone who understood that sometimes the simplest words spoken at the right moment could become the anchor to a drifting soul. I don't want to be anyone's burden, Sarah said, touching the rim of her cooled tea. But it feels like I'm pulling you into all of this too deeply. Michael shook his head slow and deliberate. You're not pulling me anywhere. I stepped in on my own. She bit her lip, her eyes turning red again. But this time it was from relief, from the realization that maybe she wasn't a burden at all, but someone worthy of being beside another human being without hiding, without shrinking, without bowing her head ever again. Sarah stepped out of the elevator and stopped cold at the sight before her. On the wide rooftop, paved with gray stone, were tables draped in white linens, glass lanterns casting a soft golden glow, and in the distance the shimmering night skyline of Portland stretched across the horizon, the air scented with jasmine and the faint warmth of wood smoke, making her feel as though she had stepped into another world far removed from the chaos, fear, and wounds she had only begun to reveal the night before. Michael was standing near the railing with his back to her, the fitted black suit sharpening the clean lines of his frame. And when he heard her footsteps, he turned, his eyes bright with something close to satisfaction. I thought you liked open spaces, he said. Not as a question, but as a certainty. Sarah smiled, walking toward him. You're right. How did you know? Michael pulled out her chair before taking a seat across from her. I pay attention. Those two simple words spoken in his low, warm voice made her heartbeat stagger for a moment. A man who noticed not to control, not to monitor, but because he wanted to understand her. The food arrived, simple yet elegant Italian dishes, and red wine filled their glasses. Sarah didn't ask the price, though she was sure the place wasn't cheap, and she told herself she should allow the evening to be what it was, a small reward after a long season of running. "Where were you born?" Michael asked as he cut into his steak. "Minnesota," Sarah replied. "A small town, snow every winter. Nothing ever changed. I thought it was home until I left." "And your parents?" "My mother died when I was 13. My father didn't really know how to raise a daughter. Thank God for my sister. She's like a mother and a best friend in one." Michael nodded, letting her guide the pace of the conversation. Sarah looked at him. "What about you? Your background sounds mysterious." Michael lifted an eyebrow, set his fork down, and turned his wine glass slowly between his fingers as if thumbing through something buried deep. "I was born and raised here on the east side of the city back when it was mostly ruins. My father was a powerful man, but not in a way one would be proud of. He did business with people no one should ever deal with. By the time I was 16, I knew how to launder money, how to keep silent, and how a person could disappear over saying the wrong sentence." Sarah stayed quiet. Michael wasn't boasting or dramatizing. He recounted his past as something inseparable from who he had become, a foundation he had been forced to rebuild, brick by brick. "I didn't want to follow in his footsteps. But you can't shed everything overnight. I started buying old buildings, fixing them, renting them. I figured that if I owned even a small part of the city, I could make that part safer." He looked at her. "Like your building." Sarah felt her chest tighten, not in fear, but in understanding. Michael wasn't simply a successful man. He was someone who had navigated darkness, someone who had risen out of the worst parts of a world that had nearly swallowed him. And instead of letting it shape him into something cruel, he shaped what he could into something safer. "I think," she whispered, "what you're doing is admirable. Not everyone is strong enough to walk away from the path laid out for them." Michael smiled, imperfect, but sincere. "I'm not stronger than anyone else, Sarah. I just know I don't want to live in fear, and I don't want the people around me to live in it either." They fell into a quiet that settled gently between them, while the city lights flickered like falling stars in the distance. And for the first time in weeks, Sarah leaned back in her chair and felt herself begin to relax. She didn't know what lay ahead, but in this moment here with this man, she knew she had taken her first step out of the shadows. And perhaps the light wasn't as far away as she once believed. After dinner, Michael led Sarah up one more level through a narrow iron staircase behind a small door a server opened only for them. And when the metal door to the upper rooftop swung open, she gasped softly. The entire city stretched beneath them, glittering like an embroidered tapestry of lights with no tables, no voices, only strands of tiny bulbs lining the railing, and a few neatly trimmed potted plants. Michael pulled a key from his pocket and locked the door behind them. "This place is mine," he said gently. "Whenever I need to think, I come up here." Sarah stepped to the railing, resting her hands as she looked down at the streets below. The breeze lifted her hair lightly off her shoulders, not cold, but cool enough to feel cleansing, and she closed her eyes for a moment to let the quiet settle into her bones, the kind of quiet she hadn't felt in a very long time. When she turned back, Michael was standing a few steps away, watching her with steady eyes. She asked, half teasing, half self-conscious. He shook his head slowly. "Nothing. It's just the first time I've seen you truly smile." Sarah blinked, surprised. Then her lips curved again, this time not politely, not out of habit, but from something softer, warmer, almost amused. "I smiled through dinner," she protested. "No," Michael said, moving a little closer. "Those were polite smiles, the kind people wear when they don't want anyone to notice they're anxious. But now you're smiling like you're exactly where you're meant to be." Sarah didn't answer because he was right. She hadn't realized it, but her entire body felt lighter, as if fear and tension and vigilance were slowly dissolving under the soft glow of the lights and his calm presence. "Maybe I forgot to be afraid," she said, her eyes drifting back toward the low buildings in the distance. "This feeling is strange, but it's nice. I want you to feel it more often." He stood beside her, close enough that his warmth brushed her shoulder. "Not because of me, but for your own sake." Sarah turned her head to look at him. The upward glow from the railing lights carved gentle angles along his cheekbones, deepened the shadows of his eyes, but there was nothing cold in them. "You know," she murmured. I used to think I wasn't worth kindness. Michael looked at her, silent. Derek made me believe I was difficult, weak, demanding. It took me a long time to separate what he said from who I actually am. Michael didn't touch her, but his words felt like the softest touch she had known in years. And you've managed to do it. Sarah smiled again, a real smile, clearer than the first, and when she looked at him, her eyes held a brightness like she had crossed an invisible threshold. Not completely, but I'm trying. Michael gazed at her as if she had lit up the whole space around them. And in that moment, Sarah understood that he didn't see a damaged woman or a fragile survivor. He saw her strength, her endurance, the way she still stood tall despite a world that had tried to break her. And somehow the way he looked at her made her feel beautiful in a way she had never understood before. Not a beauty of appearance, but the beauty of someone who had walked through darkness and still chose the light. After that night, something between them shifted in a way that was neither loud nor declared, but quiet and steady like the rhythm of breathing. Michael didn't call often, but he always sent a message in the morning and another late at night. Short questions filled with a kind of care Sarah had begun to wait for, as if it were a gentle new habit. And though they never labeled what they were or gave their connection a name, whenever Vincent came to pick her up, he always asked about both their schedules as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Some afternoons they walked together around the neighborhood, stopping at a tiny shop that sold warm cookies, or sitting silently on a park bench, watching children run through the grass. No one mentioned the word love. No one reached for the other's hand. Yet the way Michael looked at her when she talked about her childhood, and the way Sarah laughed when he grimaced at overly bitter coffee, said far more than any confession could. And the Prosec was not distance created by fear, but the respectful patience of two people who understood that whatever was forming in the quiet required time, not urgency. Michael did not push. Sarah did not retreat. They simply walked beside each other, close enough to feel the presence of the other, far enough that each remained themselves. And in that quiet, a deeper thing began to take shape. Nameless, unforced, the unmistakable sense that if one day they stepped closer, neither would turn away. That morning, Sarah arrived at the office as usual, carrying her large cup of coffee and the familiar calm that had begun settling in her chest. She was sleeping better, breathing easier, and when she looked in the mirror, her eyes no longer carried the heavy exhaustion they once did. But peace is sometimes only a thin layer of fog, and it dissipates quickly. Around 10 o'clock, she was sitting in a meeting with the accounting team when an assistant rushed in, pale and shaken, stammering that a man was waiting at reception, insisting on seeing her. And Sarah felt a cold ripple down her spine at the description. Tall, short hair, wrinkled shirt, restless eyes, and a harsh tone. She didn't need any more details to know it was Derek. Her heart thumped painfully as she stepped out of the meeting room. He was standing there in the lobby of the 14th floor, taller than she remembered, but noticeably worn down. And he turned the moment he saw her, forcing a stretched, familiar smile she had seen 100 times. You didn't answer my messages. I just want to talk. Before she could react, a low voice sounded behind him. She doesn't want to talk. Derek spun around. Vincent stood there, calm, but with eyes sharp as blades. The dark suit and discreet earpiece making him look less like a driver and more like a seasoned bodyguard. And he stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Derek and Sarah. You're causing a disturbance in this building. Leave now, or I'll call security and the police. Derek stared, then barked a laugh, harsh and ugly. Who the hell do you think you are? She's my ex. We have things to settle. Sarah is nothing to you anymore, and your business ended long ago. Vincent didn't raise his voice. He merely stood straight, hands clasped in front of him. But the look in his eyes made Derek step back on instinct. Sarah stood behind Vincent, her body tense as a pulled wire. Yet for the first time, she wasn't frozen with fear. She looked at Derek with no panic, only exhaustion. You have no right to be here. I told you to stop. I have a restraining order, and if you continue, I will let the law intervene again. Derek opened his mouth, ready to argue, but then his gaze shifted to Vincent, then to the employees, beginning to gather and watch, and perhaps for the first time, he realized he had no power left, not over Sarah, not in this place. Without a word, he turned and walked away. Long strides unsteady. Vincent didn't chase him or speak. Again, He merely watched until the elevator doors closed. And when they did, Sarah felt her knees loosen. Vincent turned to her, his voice gentle. "I've already informed Mr. He's in a meeting, but we'll call you as soon as he's done." Sarah nodded, her eyes still on the elevator. She knew this wasn't the end. Yet today, she had not been the woman who shrank under the weight of an old shadow. She had stood straight, spoken clearly, and for the first time, she had been the one to push Derek out of her space. It felt strange and right. When Sarah stepped into the quiet cafe near downtown, Michael was already seated in the far corner, away from noise and attention, wearing not his usual suit, but a dark rolled-sleeve shirt, a half-empty cup of coffee in his hand. He stood immediately when he saw her, pulling out her chair with the kind of instinct that came from habit, and his face softened when he realized she was unharmed. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and warm. She nodded, trying to smile, though her emotions were still tangled. "He came to my office," she said, "but Vincent handled it." If he hadn't been there, she didn't finish. But Michael understood. He tightened his fingers around his cup, his eyes darkening for a moment. "He has no boundaries left. That means I need to act." Something in his tone made her pause. "What did you do?" Michael was silent for a moment before lifting his gaze to hers. "I had someone look into his finances. His company isn't under his name, but the cash flow shows signs of laundering. The collateral is not legitimate, and there are at least 3 fraudulent loans." Sarah stared, stunned. "Since when?" "Since he stepped into my building. I will not wait for him to harm you again." She felt her fingers tremble as she gripped her cup. "What are you going to do with that information?" Michael studied her for a long moment. "I'm giving everything to the IRS, then to the bank. Once his accounts are frozen, that company will collapse in less than 3 months." Sarah sat still, her heart tightening. Part of her wanted to see Derek face consequences. Another part could hardly believe the man before her could speak of dismantling an entire life with such calm certainty. "Michael," she whispered, that would destroy him." Michael didn't react immediately. He leaned forward slightly. "He destroyed 3 years of yours. Made you believe you had no worth. Made you live in fear. How many others like you exist that you don't know about? How many fell into his hands and never spoke up? If I let him continue, that would be the real wrongdoing." Sarah sat quietly, torn between emotion and hesitation. She had never had anyone defend her like this, never seen anyone act with such conviction not to control her, but to protect her in a way that made her feel safe rather than small. And at the same time, it reminded her that Michael did not belong to an ordinary world. He came from a place where power did not need to shout, and justice could be delivered without a courtroom. "You're doing this because of me?" she asked softly. Michael nodded without a moment's pause. "Because of you and because of me. I don't tolerate anyone believing they can harm someone I care about without consequence." Sarah didn't know what to say. She looked down at the cup in front of her, gratitude weaving with trembling disbelief. Derek had made her feel like something small and disposable, someone unworthy of protection. Yet now, merely because she had chosen to stand and speak, a man like Michael was willing to take down an entire system for her. She drew in a long breath and met his gaze. "I don't know how far this will go, but I know I don't want to turn back. I've been silent too long. I've endured, forgiven, rationalized. If this is the only way for Derek to understand he crossed every line, then I won't stop you." Michael didn't speak. He only nodded once, slow and deep, like an unspoken vow. And in that moment, in the quiet cafe, with their coffee growing cold, Sarah understood that every boundary between them had changed. There was no distance left, no hesitation, only trust and the resolve to face whatever came next together. 3 days after their conversation at the cafe, Michael sent Sarah a simple message early in the morning telling her to keep her weekend free. No explanations, no destination, only that Vincent would pick her up at 8 o'clock on Saturday. Sarah hesitated for a few minutes before typing her agreement. When she stepped out of her building, the air was still cool and the pavement covered in a thin layer of morning mist. The black SUV was already waiting, the door opening as she approached, and Vincent greeted her with a nod, silent as always. But this time, the seat inside was empty. Michael was nowhere in sight. She was driven to a small airport on the outskirts of the city, where a private jet stood ready on the runway. Michael waited at the bottom of the stairs, sleeves rolled up, hair tousled by the wind, and his eyes lit up the moment he saw her. She let out a soft laugh at the strange, almost surreal sense of escape. He said nothing until they were seated in the cabin and the plane lifted off, Portland shrinking into a distant blur. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice half curious, half anxious. "Somewhere quiet," he replied. "You need to get away from all of it." "And so do I." After nearly an hour of flying, the jet landed at a tiny airfield near the mountains of southern Oregon. A rugged vehicle waited for them, and Michael drove through winding forest roads bordered by towering pines and autumn-red leaves cascading like a living painting. Eventually, they reached a secluded wooden cabin nestled deep in the trees, the only sounds the wind and the distant calls of forest birds. Sarah stood in the small clearing, breathing in the crisp air, and understood suddenly that Michael had been right. She needed this more than she ever realized. They cooked together, ate dinner in the glow of the fireplace, and for the first time, they spoke of nothing related to Derek, nothing about the past, only small things. Sarah told him she once wanted to be a photographer because her mother always carried an old film camera and captured every quiet moment of life. Michael admitted he once thought he would become a chef if his life had not veered down the path his father carved. "You can still take pictures," he said when she confessed she had abandoned that dream. "You can start again anytime." Something in the way he said it, so certain, so trusting, made her look at him a little longer. Not because of the advice, but because he believed in her even when she struggled to believe in herself. When night fell and the air turned colder, they sat together on the long bench outside the cabin, wrapped under a thick blanket, sipping hot cocoa. No music, no romantic lines, just two wounded souls who had once doubted everything, now sharing a rare, quiet moment. When Sarah rested her head on Michael's shoulder, he didn't move away. He simply tugged the blanket to cover them both, holding her as though she were something precious he didn't want to lose. In the slow rise and fall of their breathing, Sarah realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Derek, not of the past, and most miraculously, not of the future. Because for the first time in her life, it wasn't a dark, endless void, but a road slowly filling with light. A road she no longer had to walk alone. The mountain night was so still that she could hear the soft crackle of the fire in the stove and the faint rustle of leaves falling onto the cabin roof. After their simple dinner and long conversation, Sarah washed her hands in warm water and stepped out of the bathroom, wearing the soft sweater and loose cotton pants Michael had set out for her. She felt strangely unburdened, lying down without carrying any fear with her, no sudden knocking, no shadow stalking her mind, only the gentle glow of a lamp and the light scent of wood lingering in the air. Michael stood near the large bed by the window, his eyes on her, but his body still not approaching. He had changed into a t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly messy, hands tucked in his pockets, looking unexpectedly domestic. He asked quietly if she would be comfortable with him sleeping in the room that night on the other side of the bed without touching her, without expecting anything, only to be present. Sarah looked at him for a few seconds, then nodded. There was nothing in his eyes that felt demanding or presumptuous. If anything, the fact that he asked made her feel more respected than she ever had before. They got under the blanket from opposite sides, the bed wide enough to keep a small space between them. She turned her back toward him, but her body no longer tensed the way it once did when someone shared the room. Instead, she listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing, her pulse gradually slowing to match it. After a long, quiet stretch, she whispered, "Are you still awake?" "Yes," he replied softly. "Thank you for bringing me here." She couldn't see his smile, but she heard it in his warm response. "You deserve peace." They said nothing else, only the faint tapping of wind against the window and the soft rustle of blankets when one of them shifted. Then, slowly, as if afraid to break the fragile calm, Sarah reached a hand behind her, searching for him. Michael said nothing as he wrapped his fingers around hers. Not gripping, not pulling, simply holding, letting her know he was there. In that hand, she felt something she had never known before. Not hurried passion, not ownership or demand, but quiet, unwavering presence. Wrapped in that warmth, Sarah drifted into the first deep sleep she had in years. The next morning, gentle sunlight seeped through the thin curtains draped over the warm wooden room. Sarah woke still in Michael's arms, her head resting against his chest, his breath steady, his hand still holding hers exactly as it had through the night. She did not want to move. In that moment, there was no fear, no darkness, only silence, and the astonishing feeling of being cared for. Later, as they sat at the small table with hot coffee and slightly burnt slices of toast, Michael placed his hand on the table and spoke in a low, steady voice. He knew it might be soon, he said, but he didn't want to keep living in two separate worlds. He wanted to wake up every morning seeing her and go to sleep every night knowing she was safe. Then he asked if she would move in with him. Sarah froze, her heart briefly stopping, not because of shock, but because deep inside she had wanted this too, though she never dared name it. She looked into his eyes and saw not a temporary promise, but a place she could return to. She smiled, slow but sure. I want to. In that moment, nothing more was needed. No gifts, no declarations, no fireworks. Only two people who had once been broken, choosing to trust each other and beginning to call one place home. That afternoon, the sky was thick with clouds, and Sarah sat on the balcony of her new apartment, a book in her hand, though her eyes hadn't moved across a single line. Her mind was full of the past few days. So much peace that it almost frightened her. Not because she doubted Michael, but because she feared something might steal this feeling away. As if summoned by that uneasy intuition, her phone vibrated just as a gust of wind flipped through the pages. The caller ID showed Vincent. His voice was no longer steady as usual, but strained. Breath quickened as though he were holding himself together. Michael was attacked. He's in the hospital. She didn't ask a single question. She grabbed her coat, phone, keys, and ran down the stairs as if nothing else in the world mattered. The road to the hospital felt longer than it ever had, each minute stretching painfully in her trembling hands. Her heart pounded. Images of Michael lying lifeless flashing through her mind, even though she didn't yet know what had happened. Vincent met her at the emergency entrance, his expression grave, his eyes tight with worry, though not panicked. He led her to the waiting room, explaining as they walked. He was ambushed, leaving a parking garage after a private meeting. Two men, one with a knife. Michael fought them off, but was badly injured in the shoulder and head. The doctors are working on him. Sarah felt her face go cold, as if all the blood in her body had drained away. She sat heavily in a chair, her hands clasped so tightly her nails dug into her skin until it broke. Though she didn't notice, she didn't cry. No tears came, only a widening emptiness inside her chest, as though losing him would shatter her entire world. Vincent sat beside her in silence, offering neither platitudes nor false comfort. He understood that in moments like this, silence was the deepest form of respect for the fear strangling her heart. Nearly an hour passed, an hour that felt like an entire lifetime before the emergency room doors opened, and a doctor in a green gown stepped out, removed his mask, looked around, and called her name. Sarah jumped to her feet and hurried to him. He's not in life-threatening danger, the doctor said, but he needs shoulder surgery because the cut is deep and he has a mild head injury. Fortunately, he was brought in quickly. He's being monitored closely. She nodded over and over, clutching her chest as if holding her own heartbeat together. She asked if she could see him, and the doctor guided her toward the recovery room. When she walked in, she saw Michael lying there, eyes closed, skin pale, white bandages wrapped around his forehead and right shoulder, but he was breathing. He was still here. She moved to his bedside, sat down, and touched his cold fingers gently. "I'm here," she whispered, tears finally spilling, falling silently onto the back of his hand. "I'm not going anywhere, Michael. So, you're not allowed to go anywhere either." She stayed there for hours, unmoving, uncaring of time or anything else. In that stark white room filled with quiet and the steady rhythm of machines, love did not need to be spoken aloud. It lived in presence, in a breath that still rose and fell, in a hand she refused to let go, enough to keep her standing in the middle of the storm that had just crashed into their lives. 2 days after the attack, while Michael still lay in the post-operative care room with white bandages wrapped around his shoulder and forehead, a plainclothes officer appeared at the hospital. He introduced himself as Detective William Hayes from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Portland Police Bureau, his face calm, but his eyes sharp and probing like a blade honed to precision. Sarah was seated beside Michael's bed when the nurse stepped in to announce someone needed to see him. And before she could decline, the officer was already standing in the doorway, notebook in hand, and his badge glinting under the fluorescent light. Michael instinctively tried to sit up when he saw him, but Sarah immediately placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, urging him to remain still. Detective William Hayes spoke politely, explaining that he only had a few routine questions for the investigation and that it would not take long. He stepped inside, pulled up a chair, and uncapped a silver pen poised over a blank page. "Stone, do you know anyone who might want to harm you?" Michael closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again, answering in a rough voice softened by pain medication. "I run businesses," he said. "Sometimes competition gets intense, but knife attacks are not typical forms of competition." Hayes nodded, jotting something down, then fixed his gaze directly on Michael. "Competition in what industry?" There was a pause before Michael answered. "Real estate, investments, a few private ventures." Hayes looked at him as though waiting for something more honest, then asked, "Have you ever been associated with corporate entities or individuals previously investigated for money laundering, loan sharking, or other illicit activities?" Sarah saw Michael's body tense, not out of fear, but with the stillness of someone who had heard questions like these his entire life. He replied without hesitation, "No, I have worked with many partners. If any of them were under investigation, I was never informed." Hayes nodded again, though the edge in his eyes did not soften. "Then are you aware that we found no surveillance footage from the garage where the attack occurred?" Michael raised a brow. "No footage." Hayes said the cameras were disabled 10 minutes before the incident. No direct witnesses, and the two assailants wore hoods, acted fast, efficient, professional. Sarah felt her throat go dry. She glanced at Michael, noticing him close his eyes for a moment before responding in a lower voice. "Then someone planned it in advance. I do not have personal enemies bold enough to do something like that in public." Hayes stopped writing, snapped the notebook shut, and leaned back slightly. "There is something odd, Mr. Most attacks of this type target the victim when he is alone, in the dark, in a quiet place. But you were attacked in a commercial garage at peak hour. It looks less like someone wanted you gone and more like someone wanted you found in time." Michael did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was choosing his words with extreme care. After a long beat, Hayes rose to his feet. "We will continue the investigation. If you remember anything at all, call me." He placed a card on the bedside table, nodded briefly at Sarah, and left. The door closed softly, and the room fell back into silence. Michael stared at the ceiling for a long moment before speaking. "They suspect me. I can see it." Sarah tightened her grasp on his hand. "They will not find anything because you have done nothing wrong." Michael turned to her, something different in his eyes. Not fear, but a cold, clear realism. "There are things I did before," he said quietly. "Things that leave no evidence, but cannot be erased from how people see me. I have crossed lines, Sarah, but I am trying to live differently now." She did not release his hand. "I know, and they will see that too. But if there is anything you have not told me, tell me now." Michael was silent for several seconds, then nodded slowly. She knew the moment was coming, and it would not be easy, but she also knew that whatever truth emerged, their love now required not only trust, but courage. That evening, when Michael was finally able to sit up and take a few spoonfuls of soup, Sarah sat beside him, folding his napkin quietly. The hospital room hushed, except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. She spoke no words, only waited. He watched her for a long moment, then released a deep, weighted breath, as though the thing he was about to reveal had lived in his chest for years. He once believed he would never need to speak of it, that burying the past deeply enough would keep it from touching the present. But he had been wrong. Michael began to speak in a low voice, steady, unflinching, without excuses. His father had been an Italian immigrant, a cold-blooded man who called himself a businessman. Though everyone in the Southern District knew he orchestrated what happened behind the curtain, gambling, protection rackets, smuggling, and sometimes even the price of a human life. Michael grew up in that world with no real choice. At 15, he was sent to collect debts. At 17, he witnessed his first beating so brutal the man's face was unrecognizable. Michael never laid a hand on anyone, but he stayed silent. He had learned to live with that silence as part of his reality. Then his mother died in a car accident no one ever investigated. Michael knew she had not been the target, only collateral damage in a dispute between his father and another family within the same system. After her death, he began distancing himself, searching quietly for a way out. But such a world does not release people willingly. Under the guise of real estate projects, Michael began laundering money for his father, learning how to establish shell companies, how to use the law as a shield. But inside, he despised what he was becoming. One night, after a mistake in paperwork forced an innocent man to lose his home, Michael stood before the mirror and no longer recognized his reflection. He knew if he stayed, he would become his father's perfect replica. So he severed ties. He discreetly sold his shares, transferred certain assets to people unconnected to the organization. He did not flee, nor did he betray anyone. He simply stepped out of that life, leaving no trace. It angered several people, but he was luckier than most because he knew the rules, and he knew how to keep quiet. He spent the following years living legitimately, with only faint shadows lingering in his financial history. Shadows no one would see unless they dug deep. When Derek began moving into his market, Michael recognized the type instantly dangerous, not because he was powerful, but because he believed himself untouchable, the same delusion his father once had. Sarah sat motionless, her hands clasped painfully tight in her lap. Michael turned toward her, no longer shielding his eyes. "You have the right to walk away," he said. "I will not stop you, and I will not blame you if you cannot accept this, but I want you to know I am not my father. I chose another path, and I walk it every day." Sarah stared at him for a long breath, held silence, then stood, moved to the edge of his bed, sat beside him, and took his hand. "I do not need someone perfect," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I just need someone who faces their darkness and chooses to leave it behind. You did that, and I believe you." Michael squeezed her hand gently, saying nothing. In the dim light and the sound of rain tapping against the hospital window, a new chapter between them quietly began, built not on sweet promises, but on truth, courage, and the kind of forgiveness only real love can offer. After the night, Michael revealed everything. Sarah did not sleep. She sat in the corner of the hospital room, her face lit by the monitor's glow, her eyes deep and fiercely awake. She was not afraid of his past, nor of his confession. What tightened in her chest was not fear, but the cold, familiar sensation of losing control that she had once lived under for years, with a man like Derek, always reacting, always shrinking to survive. But not this time. She would not run again. She would not let the man she loved be hurt, nor allow his past to become a weapon others could use to manipulate the present. When morning came and Michael opened his eyes, she was sitting at the small table with her laptop open and a notebook filled with handwritten plans. He stared at her startled as she ended a phone call with a calmness that felt practiced. "I spoke with your lawyer," Sarah said when she hung up. "I need you to give me all your financial files on Derek, everything you gathered. And I need your head of security to meet me today." Michael pushed himself upright, his eyes narrowing. "What are you planning?" Sarah turned toward him, and the look she gave him was not that of the frightened woman who once froze outside her own apartment door. "I am planning to protect us. Not by running, by confronting this. I will take everything to the tax authorities, and I want a civil attorney working in parallel. If necessary, I will testify. I will sign whatever is needed. I have nothing left to lose, Michael, and I will not sit back and watch someone else pay the price for me." Michael was silent. He had never seen her so strong, not because she was fearless, but because she had finally chosen not to let fear dictate her life. He watched her as if seeing her for the first time, and yet she was exactly the woman he had always loved. Only now she was no longer hiding her strength. Vincent arrived by noon. Sarah laid out every step she needed taken, asking him to contact two former financial investigators Michael had once worked with. She wanted every document reviewed, every detail prepared, so that once submitted, nothing could be dismissed. Michael watched her with growing awe, each instruction, each decision, each piece of resolve she put on the table, stunned and quietly proud. He had once believed he would have to protect her forever. Yet today, she was the one standing between him and the world, fighting for him in ways no one else ever had. And in his heart, something unfolded slowly, like sunlight after rain. She was not only the woman he loved, She was the woman he could trust with everything he was. When night fell, Sarah sat again at his bedside, exhausted yet unwavering. "I do not know where this will lead," she whispered. "But I know that if we do nothing, the past will always return. I lived in fear once. Now I choose to stand. And I am not going anywhere." Michael took her hand and held it tightly, his eyes damp, though no tears fell. In that moment, they were no longer two people fleeing their histories. They were a team, facing whatever came next together. The meeting was arranged on a gray afternoon inside an old warehouse by the river that had once served as a transit point for the organization in years past. Michael still could not drive on his own, so Vincent brought them both. But it was Sarah who stepped out first, standing tall, her expression steady and without hesitation. The man waiting inside was Antonio, one of the last remaining links of the old network, once close to Michael's father, and someone who knew exactly what Michael had done and what he had refused to do. Antonio stood with his arms crossed, a look of half-mocking, half-guarded surprise flickering across his face at the sight of a woman entering ahead of Michael. But Sarah did not lower her gaze. She placed a folder on the dusty wooden table and opened it, revealing paperwork, financial statements, photographs, and the names of associates connected to Derek along with the financial ties between him and one of the shell companies still operating under the remnants of the old organization. "If you do not want to be dragged into the financial scandal the FBI is watching," she said calmly, "then this is your chance to cut loose. Derek is rotting the system from the inside, using the old network for his personal gain. And now there is proof." Antonio glanced at Michael as if waiting for confirmation. Michael gave a slight nod. "It is the truth. And if you do not want the entire organization to go down with him, then let us handle him legally. But if you still think you can control him, then be prepared to drown with him when the IRS and state investigators come in at the same time." Sarah held his gaze without blinking, her voice so steady it seemed she had been born for this moment. A long silence followed. Then Antonio exhaled a humorless chuckle and gave a slow nod. "Fine, we will withdraw, but if there is anything off in this, it will be the last time you ever walk into a place like this." Sarah said nothing. She simply closed the folder, turned, and walked out toward the sunlight where Michael was waiting. When the metal door slammed shut behind them, Michael took her hand without a word. He did not need to speak because in his eyes she had not only saved him, she had ended the shadow that had followed both of them from the past. The moment Michael was cleared to leave, the hospital arrived on a morning threaded with soft sunlight, brightening a room that had grown too accustomed to dimness and the hum of machines. Sarah stood beside the bed, gripping the discharge papers, her smile unable to hide how long she had been waiting for this day. Michael still wore a bandage across his shoulder, moved slowly and cautiously, but the sharp alive spark had returned to his eyes. On the drive back, none of them spoke. Even Vincent kept silent, sensing there was something quietly reborn between the two of them that required no grand words. When they reached the apartment, Sarah opened the door and let Michael step inside first. He paused in the middle of the familiar living room, the place that had once been a hideout, the place Derek had shattered with pounding fists, the place Michael had quietly sat that first night so she would not feel alone. Now the apartment was no longer a shelter. It was a beginning. Michael turned to her, and for the first time after everything, he spoke without any guardedness. "I want this to be our real home. No other place, no conditions, just you." Sarah smiled, stepped forward, and wrapped her arms around him. The embrace, gentle yet firm, warm, full of promise. The weeks that followed passed quietly. They rearranged furniture, discarded what no longer mattered, hung new photos, changed the curtains. Sarah began taking pictures again, her first time since college. Michael helped her build a tiny darkroom in the spare room, drilling hooks, installing red lights with his own hands. She was surprised by his patience, and when she asked, he only shrugged and said that if you were choosing to live again, then I want to start over too. Michael's physical wounds healed faster than either expected, but the unseen wounds required the real care. Some nights he jolted awake, sweat dampening his temples, haunted by nightmares he could not name. Sarah never asked. She simply held him close, whispering until his breathing steadied. And on certain mornings, she stared blankly into her coffee, pulled back into the long years of Derek's manipulation. He simply guided her hand to his chest, letting her rest her palm over the steady beat of his heart. I am here. You are here. And slowly, day by day, they rebuilt. Not with milestones or grand declarations, but through the quiet, steady work of two people who had chosen trust, forgiveness, and love again. They did not need the past to disappear, only for it to stop steering the future. And in that ordinary life, simple and unremarkable on the surface, they discovered the thing they had never believed they would ever find again: genuine peace. The news of Sarah's pregnancy arrived on a May morning, sunlight spilling across the kitchen as she stood, staring at the two faint lines on the test. For a very long time, she did not cry or shout. She simply placed a hand against her stomach where nothing could yet be seen, but where a strange certainty whispered that everything was about to change. Michael walked in a few minutes later, fastening the last button on his shirt, his eyes scanning her face before stopping completely. He did not ask. He stepped toward her and gently laid his hand over hers. She nodded. His response was a slow smile, small, steady, warm enough to tighten her throat. They stood there in silence, holding a moment too sacred for words. A week later, as Michael was about to drive her to her first prenatal appointment, Vincent called, his voice lower than usual. Derek had been released from jail a few days earlier for a charge unrelated to her, but it appeared he was trying to make contact again. A former employee of Derek's had been arrested for leaking data, and in the deposition, Derek had blamed all of his failures on Sarah. Michael tightened his grip on the phone, eyes darkening, not with rage this time, but with a colder, more decisive clarity. He looked at Sarah sitting on the sofa, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, her expression calm, steady. She said, "If he comes back, I am not running. But I want this to end cleanly, properly." Michael nodded without argument. The next day, Derek showed up in the parking lot of an old office building where Sarah once worked. What he did not expect was to find Vincent waiting with two security men in black suits. Vincent walked forward, an envelope in hand. Inside were the final documents tied to Derek, the complete buyout of his remaining assets, the debts Michael had already handled through his attorneys, all exchanged for a single condition. Derek would leave Oregon and never contact Sarah again. If he violated that agreement, every piece of evidence linking him to the old organization, the evidence Michael and Sarah now held, would go straight to federal authorities. Derek looked at Vincent, then at the two silent guards behind him, his face slack not in acceptance, but because he knew there was no way out this time. No one threatened him, but everyone present was ready to close this chapter once and for all. He took the envelope, turned, and walked away without a word. Sarah watched from a distance through the car window, her hand gripping Michael's. She felt no satisfaction, no sudden relief, only the quiet sensation of a long, painful chapter gently turning its final page. That night, they sat together on the bed, Michael's hand resting on her stomach, where their new life grew quietly day by day. She leaned against his shoulder and whispered that if it was a girl, she wanted their daughter to know her mother had once been afraid, but had learned to stand. Michael smiled softly and murmured that he wanted their child to know her father had once lived in darkness, but chose to step out so he could see the light with the woman he loved. Their story was not ending, but the most painful pages had finally been folded away. Ahead lay a different life waiting to be written. A life with no shadows chasing them, only love, trust, and the tiny heartbeat that had become their greatest hope. One autumn afternoon, when the leaves had begun to turn gold and sunlight slanted gently through the living room window of their small suburban home, Sarah sat beside her daughter on an old wooden rocking chair. The girl was 12 then, with amber eyes that mirrored her father's, yet carried the quiet depth of her mother's gaze. She had just finished an assignment about the people who inspire you in life, and she asked her mother softly if she had ever been truly afraid. Sarah smiled tender, but shadowed by a faint ache of memory. "I was once so afraid," she said, "that I wished I could disappear from the world. There were days I woke up and wished I had never existed. I lived with someone who made me believe I had no worth, that I deserved to be controlled, silenced, and diminished. I thought that was love. But then I learned real love does not wound you like that. Real love helps you become a better version of yourself. Then I met your father. Not in a perfect moment, and not in a romantic one either. He carried a past and shadows and pieces of himself that I had to learn how to face. But what mattered is this. He chose to change, and I chose to believe in him. Not everyone is brave enough to walk away from the road they once lived on. And not everyone is willing to hold the hand of someone who is trying to step out of the dark. We survived things together that once felt impossible. There were moments when I wanted to give up. Moments when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing by loving a man who once belonged to a dangerous world. But real love, sweetheart, is exactly that. It is not perfect. It is not glamorous, but it is steady and forgiving. I want you to know that courage does not mean the absence of fear. Courage is what happens when you keep walking even while you are afraid. When you protect the people you love, even though your heart feels fragile. When you choose forgiveness over bitterness. When you rebuild your life from the ruins without needing anyone's applause. And I want you to understand that true love does not require control or conditions or bargaining. It is presence. It is showing up on the stormiest days and the brightest ones and choosing one another again and again. The girl said nothing. She simply wrapped her arms tightly around her mother. And in that moment, Sarah felt that everything she had endured, every wound, every fall, every step back into the light was worth it. If it meant her daughter could grow up in a safer world, one where she understood courage and loved with a heart that did not know fear. 5 years had passed since that autumn conversation with their daughter, and Sarah found herself standing in the kitchen of their expanded home, watching through the window as Michael taught their now 17-year-old daughter, Grace, how to change the oil in her first car. The sight filled her with a contentment she had never imagined possible during those dark months when Derek's shadow loomed over everything she did. Grace had grown into a remarkable young woman, inheriting her father's quiet strength and her mother's compassionate heart. She volunteered at the local women's shelter, having learned early that courage meant standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Sarah smiled as she watched her daughter's determined expression, so similar to the one she herself had worn when she finally decided to stop running from her past. The photography studio Sarah had built in the converted garage had become more than just a creative outlet. It had evolved into a thriving business specializing in portraits of domestic violence survivors, women who wanted to capture their strength and resilience in images that spoke louder than words. Each session was a small act of healing, both for her subjects and for herself. Michael appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a towel, grease smudged on his cheek. He had traded his expensive suits for work clothes most days, finding more satisfaction in the hands-on restoration of old buildings than he had ever found in boardroom negotiations. His real estate empire had transformed into something meaningful, providing affordable housing for families transitioning out of difficult situations. The foundation meeting is in an hour, he reminded her gently, kissing her forehead. Vincent is bringing the car around. The Sarah Michael Foundation had started small, just a single safe house in downtown Portland. Now it operated 6 facilities across Oregon and Washington, providing not just shelter, but comprehensive support services. Sarah had insisted they name it after both of them, though she often joked that Michael's business acumen was the only reason their dream had become reality. As they drove through the city, Sarah watched the familiar neighborhoods pass by. So much had changed, yet some things remained beautifully constant. Vincent still served as Michael's right hand, though his role had evolved from security to operations management. His quiet efficiency had proven invaluable in running their growing network of facilities. The board meeting was routine, reviewing expansion plans and success metrics that told stories of lives rebuilt. Sarah listened to the reports with half her attention, her mind drifting to a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from a woman named Lisa, a graduate of their program who had just completed nursing school. She wanted to come back and work for the foundation, to help other women the way she had been helped. After the meeting, Michael and Sarah walked through the original safe house, greeting staff and residents. In the children's playroom, Sarah paused to watch a little girl, maybe 6 years old, carefully coloring a picture of a house with a red door. The child looked up and smiled, offering to show Sarah her artwork. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, kneeling down to the girl's level. "What's special about the red door?" "My mama says red doors mean safe places," the little girl replied seriously. "She says we're going to have our own red door someday." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. She remembered being that age, believing that safety was something other people had, never imagining she might deserve it for herself. Now she was part of creating that safety for others, one red door at a time. That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table, a tradition Sarah had insisted upon despite their busy schedules. Grace was telling them about her college applications, her plans to study social work with a focus on trauma therapy. Michael listened with quiet pride, occasionally asking questions that showed how carefully he considered every word his daughter spoke. "I want to work with the foundation eventually," Grace announced. "But first I want to understand the psychology behind healing, the way people rebuild themselves after trauma." Sarah exchanged a glance with Michael. Their daughter's path had been shaped by the stories she had grown up hearing, the work she had seen her parents do. But it was entirely her own choice, driven by her own sense of purpose. Later that night, as Sarah edited photographs in her studio, she came across an image from earlier that day. It was a candid shot of Michael helping Grace with her car, both of them laughing at some shared joke. The composition was perfect, but more than that, it captured something essential about the life they had built together. Trust, patience, the quiet joy of ordinary moments. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. For a split second, the old fear tried to surface, but she pushed it aside and opened the message. It was from Rebecca, a woman who had stayed at their first safe house 3 years ago. She was writing to let Sarah know she had just bought her first home, a small house with, as she put it, the most beautiful red front door you've ever seen. Sarah smiled and showed the message to Michael when he came to check on her. He read it over her shoulder, his arms settling around her waist as he pulled her against his chest. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Derek had never shown up that night?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question. "I think we would have found each other somehow," she said finally. "Maybe not that night, maybe not in that way, but I think the universe was conspiring to bring us together. Even with all my baggage?" Michael asked, a trace of his old uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Especially with all your baggage," Sarah replied, turning in his arms to face him. "We both needed someone who understood that the past doesn't define the future unless we let it." The next morning brought news that would test everything they had built together. Vincent appeared at their door before sunrise, his expression grim. Derek had been found dead in a hotel room in Las Vegas, an apparent suicide. There was a note, rambling and angry, blaming Sarah for the destruction of his life, threatening that others would finish what he had started. Sarah felt the familiar chill of fear, but this time it was different. She wasn't alone, wasn't defenseless, wasn't the woman who had once cowered behind her apartment door. She was surrounded by people who would protect her, and more importantly, she had learned to protect herself. The police investigation was thorough but brief. Derek had been living under an assumed name, working menial jobs, drinking heavily. The people he claimed would continue his vendetta turned out to be figments of an increasingly paranoid mind. His threats were empty, the final desperate act of a man who had never learned to take responsibility for his own choices. At Derek's memorial service, which Sarah attended despite everyone's protests, she sat in the back row and tried to find some forgiveness for the man who had caused her so much pain. She didn't succeed entirely, but she found something else instead: peace. The certainty that his death marked the true end of a chapter that had been closed for years. Grace, now 18 and preparing for college, asked her mother how she felt about Derek's death. They were in Sarah's studio, working together to prepare an exhibition of portraits titled Survivors, Portraits of Strength. "I feel sad," Sarah admitted. "Not for him, exactly, but for the person he might have been if he had chosen differently. And I feel grateful that I'll never have to wonder if he might come back." The exhibition opened on a rainy Thursday evening in October. The gallery was packed with survivors, supporters, families, and community leaders. Each portrait told a story without words, capturing the moment when fear transformed into strength, when survival became triumph. Michael stood beside Sarah as she gave a brief speech about the project. She talked about the importance of seeing and being seen, of recognizing that healing was both an individual journey and a collective responsibility. Her voice was steady, confident, bearing no trace of the terrified woman she had once been. "These photographs represent more than personal transformation," she concluded. "They represent the possibility that exists in every moment when someone chooses courage over comfort, connection over isolation, hope over despair. The applause was warm and sustained, but Sarah barely heard it. She was looking at Grace, who stood near the back of the gallery with tears in her eyes and pride written across her features. At Vincent, who had become like family, steady and protective and utterly reliable. At Michael, whose love had been the foundation upon which she had rebuilt not just her life, but her understanding of what life could be. After the last guests had left and the gallery had been cleaned up, the four of them sat in the empty space, surrounded by photographs that testified to the power of human resilience. Grace was curled up in one corner, scrolling through social media posts about the exhibition. Vincent was reviewing security footage from the evening, a habit he had never quite broken. Michael and Sarah sat together on a bench in the center of the room, her head resting on his shoulder, his fingers playing absently with her hair. 20 years had passed since that night, when Derek had pounded on her door and Michael had stepped between them. 20 years of building a life that honored both their struggles and their strength. "What do you think comes next?" Michael asked, his voice soft in the quiet space. Sarah considered the question. Grace would leave for college in a few months, beginning her own journey into adulthood. The foundation was stable and growing, touching more lives each year. Their love had weathered every storm and emerged stronger, deeper, more resilient than either of them had dared to hope. "I think we keep doing what we're doing," she said finally. "We keep creating safe spaces. We keep telling stories that matter. We keep choosing love, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." Michael smiled and pulled her closer. "I like that plan." Outside, the rain had stopped, and street lights illuminated the wet pavement like scattered diamonds. Portland slept around them, a city full of people carrying their own stories of loss and healing, struggle and triumph. Somewhere in that sleeping city were women who would wake tomorrow and choose to leave dangerous situations. Others who would find the courage to ask for help. Still others who would discover that they were stronger than they had ever imagined. Sarah and Michael's story was just one thread in an enormous tapestry of human experience. But it was their thread, woven with intention and care and an unwavering commitment to the belief that everyone deserves to be safe, to be loved, to be seen for who they truly are rather than what has been done to them. As they finally locked up the gallery and headed home, Sarah reflected on how different this night was from that terrible evening when her world had seemed to be ending. Then, she had been alone, afraid, certain that her past would always define her future. Now she was surrounded by love, engaged in meaningful work, confident in her own strength and resilience. The foundation continued to grow, touching lives across the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Sarah's photography evolved as well, expanding beyond portraits to documentary work that shed light on the complex realities of domestic violence and recovery. She traveled to conferences, sharing her story and her images, always emphasizing that healing was possible and help was available. Michael's business interests aligned increasingly with their shared mission. He developed partnerships with other organizations, creating a network of support that extended far beyond their foundation's direct reach. His past, once a source of shame and secrecy, became a tool for understanding and helping others who were trying to leave dangerous situations behind. Grace thrived in college, studying psychology and social work with a passion that reminded both her parents of themselves at her age. She interned with organizations that supported survivors of domestic violence, bringing fresh perspectives and boundless energy to work that could be emotionally draining for seasoned professionals. During her sophomore year, Grace called home with exciting news. She had been selected for a research project studying the long-term effects of trauma-informed care on children who had witnessed domestic violence. Her faculty advisor had specifically mentioned Sarah and Michael's foundation as an example of best practices in the field. "I'm following in your footsteps," Grace told them during a video call, her face glowing with excitement and purpose. "But I'm also finding my own path." It was exactly what they had hoped for when they decided to be open with her about their past, to let her grow up understanding both the darkness that people were capable of and the light that could emerge from the deepest struggles. Years passed in a rhythm of meaningful work, family dinners, quiet moments of connection, and the ongoing process of building a life that honored their values. Sarah's hair began to show threads of silver. Michael developed laugh lines around his eyes. They grew older together, their love deepening and strengthening with each passing season. On their 25th wedding anniversary, they returned to the mountain cabin where they had first talked about moving in together. The same cabin where Michael had asked her to trust him with her future, and where she had said yes to a life she had never imagined possible. They sat on the same bench where they had once shared hot cocoa and tentative hope, now sharing wine and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. The forest around them was unchanged, timeless, a reminder that some things endure despite the chaos and uncertainty of human experience. "Do you have any regrets?" Sarah asked, the question she had been carrying for months without quite knowing why. Michael was quiet for a long time, considering her words with the same careful attention he had always brought to conversations about their relationship. "I regret that it took me so long to find you," he said finally. "I regret that you had to go through what you did with Derek. I regret that my past made things complicated for us. But I don't regret any of the choices we made together." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Their path had been difficult, marked by trauma and fear and the hard work of healing. But it had led them to each other, to grace, to the foundation, to a life of purpose and meaning that neither of them could have achieved alone. "I love you," she said, the words carrying the weight of 25 years of partnership, struggle, growth, and unwavering commitment. "I love you too," he replied, pulling her into his arms as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. They stayed at the cabin for a week, hiking familiar trails, cooking simple meals, talking about dreams for the future and memories from the past. On their last evening, they built a fire outside and sat watching the flames dance against the darkness. "I want to start a scholarship program," Sarah said suddenly, "for kids who grew up in homes affected by domestic violence. Full rides to college, plus counseling support and mentorship." Michael smiled. "How big are you thinking?" "Big enough to matter. Start with 10 students per year, see what we learn, then expand. Grace could help us design it when she graduates." "I like it," Michael said. "I think we have the resources to make it happen." They spent the rest of the evening planning, their voices mixing with the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the forest. It felt like the conversations they used to have when they were first together, full of possibility and shared purpose. When they returned to Portland, they threw themselves into developing the scholarship program with the same passion they had brought to every aspect of their foundation's work. Sarah interviewed potential recipients, looking for young people who showed resilience, determination, and a commitment to using their education to help others. The first group of scholarship recipients was diverse in every way except their shared experience of growing up in difficult circumstances. There was Maria, whose mother had fled an abusive marriage when Maria was 12, eventually building a successful catering business. James, who had been raised by his grandmother after his father was imprisoned for domestic violence. Keisha, who had aged out of foster care but refused to give up her dream of becoming a doctor. Each student brought their own story, their own strengths, their own vision for how they wanted to use their education. Sarah and Michael provided not just financial support but mentorship, helping the students navigate college life and plan for careers that would allow them to give back to their communities. Grace, now graduated and working as a trauma therapist, helped design the program's counseling components. She understood better than anyone how childhood exposure to violence could shape a person's worldview, and she was passionate about ensuring that the scholarship recipients had access to the mental health support they needed to thrive. "What you and Dad built together," Grace told Sarah during one of their regular coffee dates. "It's bigger than just the foundation or the safe houses or even the scholarship program. You built a template for how people can heal together, how love can be stronger than trauma." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. It was the greatest compliment she could imagine receiving, especially from the daughter who had grown up watching her parents navigate the complexities of building a life from the ruins of difficult pasts. The scholarship program grew rapidly, funded by donations from supporters who had followed Sarah and Michael's work over the years. Within 5 years, they were supporting 50 students annually, and similar programs were being launched in other cities by organizations that wanted to replicate their model. Sarah continued her photography work, but increasingly, she found herself drawn to teaching. She developed workshops for survivors who wanted to use art as a tool for healing, helping people discover that creativity could be a powerful form of self-expression and emotional processing. Michael remained involved in the business side of their operations, but he too found new ways to contribute. He began speaking at conferences about the intersection of corporate responsibility and social justice, arguing that businesses had an obligation to address the systemic issues that contributed to domestic violence and other forms of harm. As they entered their 60s, Sarah and Michael began to think seriously about succession planning. The foundation they had built was too important to be dependent on their continued leadership, and they wanted to ensure that it would continue to thrive long after they were no longer able to guide its direction. Grace was the obvious choice to eventually lead the organization, but they all agreed that she needed more experience first. She was appointed to the board of directors and began taking on increasing responsibilities, learning from Vincent and other long-term staff members who had been instrumental in the foundation's growth. "I want to expand internationally," Grace announced during a board meeting. "There are organizations doing similar work in other countries, and I think we could learn from them while also sharing what we've developed here." Sarah and Michael exchanged a glance across the conference table. It was ambitious, exciting, and exactly the kind of vision that would ensure the foundation's continued growth and impact. "Tell us more," Michael said, leaning forward with interest. Grace presented a detailed proposal she had been developing for months, outlining potential partnerships with organizations in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. She had already made preliminary contact with several groups and had received enthusiastic responses. "I think we start small," she concluded. "Maybe a pilot exchange program where staff from different organizations spend time learning from each other. See what works, what doesn't, what we can adapt to different cultural contexts." The board approved the proposal unanimously, and within 6 months, the first international exchange was underway. A social worker from Toronto spent 2 months in Portland, while one of the foundation's counselors traveled to Canada to learn about their approach to supporting Indigenous survivors of domestic violence. The program was so successful that requests for participation began coming in from around the world. Sarah found herself traveling to conferences in Europe and Asia, sharing her story and learning about the different ways that communities were addressing domestic violence and its aftermath. Each trip reinforced her belief that while the specific manifestations of violence might vary across cultures, the fundamental human needs for safety, respect, and love were universal. The photographs she took during these travels became the basis for a new exhibition, Global Voices, Stories of Survival and Strength. The exhibition toured internationally, raising awareness and funds for domestic violence organizations in dozens of countries. Sarah was particularly moved by the response in communities where discussing domestic violence was still heavily stigmatized. She watched women approach the photographs with tears in their eyes, seeing their own experiences reflected in the faces of survivors from different continents. "Art has a way of crossing boundaries that policy and politics cannot," she told a reporter in London. "When someone sees their own pain and strength reflected in another person's story, it breaks down isolation and builds connection." As Sarah and Michael approached their 70th birthdays, they began to step back from day-to-day operations of the foundation, though they remained actively involved as advisors and ambassadors. Grace had grown into her leadership role, bringing fresh energy and new ideas while honoring the core values that had guided the organization from its beginning. The foundation now operated in 12 states and had partnerships with organizations in 15 countries. The scholarship program had supported more than 500 students, many of whom had gone on to careers in social work, law, medicine, and education. The safe houses had provided shelter and support to thousands of families, helping them rebuild their lives and break cycles of violence. Sarah's photography had evolved into a comprehensive archive of survivor stories, housed at a university research center where scholars could study the intersection of art, trauma, and healing. Michael's business model for socially responsible development had been adopted by developers across the country, proving that it was possible to create profitable enterprises while also addressing community needs. On a quiet Tuesday evening in spring, Sarah and Michael sat in their garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of pink and gold. Grace and her partner were coming for dinner, bringing their toddler son who had recently learned to walk and seemed determined to explore every inch of his grandparents' yard. "Do you think we've made a difference?" Sarah asked, the question that had been on her mind as she reflected on their decades of work together. Michael considered her words, as he always did. "I think," he said finally, "that we've made the difference we were capable of making. And I think the people whose lives we've touched will continue making differences in ways we'll never know about." It was a satisfying answer, realistic but hopeful. They had never set out to change the world, only to create small pockets of safety and healing wherever they could. But those small pockets had grown and connected, becoming part of a larger movement toward recognizing that everyone deserved to live free from violence and fear. As the years passed and Sarah and Michael grew older, their love story became something of a legend within the community of domestic violence advocates. Not because it was perfect, but because it demonstrated that healing was possible, that people could overcome even the most difficult circumstances, and that love could indeed be stronger than trauma. Young couples working in the field would sometimes seek them out for advice, wanting to know how they had maintained their relationship while doing such emotionally demanding work. Sarah and Michael always emphasized that it hadn't been easy, that they had needed therapy, patience, and the willingness to keep choosing each other even during difficult periods. "Love isn't something that just happens to you," Sarah would tell these young couples. "It's something you practice, every day, sometimes every hour. It's a decision you make over and over again to see the best in each other, to support each other's growth, to create safety for each other's vulnerabilities." Michael would add that their shared mission had given their relationship a foundation that went beyond personal happiness. "When you're working together towards something bigger than yourselves," he would say, "it gives you perspective on the small problems and strength to face the big ones." On their 40th wedding anniversary, the foundation organized a celebration that brought together survivors, staff, board members, scholarship recipients, and supporters from around the world. It was held in the original safe house, which had been expanded and renovated over the years, but still maintained its welcoming, home-like atmosphere. Sarah looked around the crowded room, seeing faces that represented decades of shared work and shared commitment to the belief that everyone deserved to live with dignity and safety. Grace was mingling with guests, her own children playing with the children of other staff members. Vincent, now in his 80s but still sharp and dependable, was telling stories to a group of young volunteers. "What do you see when you look around this room?" Michael asked, following her gaze. "I see the future," Sarah replied without hesitation. "All these people who will continue the work, who will adapt it and improve it, and take it places we never imagined." Michael nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They had started with the simple goal of creating one safe house, driven by their own experiences and their desire to help others. But they had inadvertently built something much larger, a community, a movement, a living demonstration that healing was not only possible, but sustainable. As the celebration continued around them, Sarah and Michael found a quiet corner where they could watch without being the center of attention. They held hands, not needing to say much, comfortable in the companionship of 4 decades together. "Thank you," Sarah said eventually. "For what?" "For stepping between me and the door that night. For staying when things got complicated. For believing that we could build something beautiful together." Michael squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for letting me stay. For trusting me with your story. For seeing who I could become instead of only who I had been." They sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sound of conversations and laughter, watching the next generation of advocates and survivors and supporters continue the work they had begun. It was the perfect ending to a story that had started with fear and isolation, but had grown into love, community, and hope. But it wasn't really an ending at all. It was just another beginning, another moment in the ongoing story of people choosing connection over isolation, healing over harm, love over fear. The work would continue, carried forward by new hands and new voices, but always rooted in the same fundamental belief that had guided Sarah and Michael from that very first night. Everyone deserves to be safe, to be loved, to be seen for who they truly are. My dear friend, if you have stayed with us until this final part of our extended journey, thank you for walking alongside this emotional story of healing and hope. And what about you? What do you think about Sarah and Michael's complete story? Have you ever witnessed how love can transform not just 2 people, but entire communities. Have you ever seen how facing darkness together can create light for countless others? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We read every word you write from the heart. If this story touched something inside you, please remember to like, share, and especially subscribe to our channel so you can continue joining us in the meaningful, heartfelt journeys ahead. Every subscription from you is a tremendous encouragement that helps us create more stories that matter each day. Thank you for spending your time listening to this complete tale of courage, love, and the power of choosing hope. Wishing you good health, a peaceful life, and calm in your heart every single day. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next.